I'm hoping today is going to be an opportunity for us to not talk only about what has happened, but also what are the ways that we can actually take things way further into the future. So yeah, hopefully everyone else is as excited as I am. But I wanted to start this talk by giving a little bit of a recap of 2021 and 2022. We've had this sort of massive explosion in the Web3 space of people working on gaming, and so it might be useful to look and see where we've come from. Unfortunately, it is not the prettiest picture. I think the theme of this last bull cycle, as people thought about what does it mean to bring Web3 into gaming, was largely focused on sort of like the short term. What we saw is a bunch of things that were more like, I guess, hype more than what one might call sustainable. And I think it's worth asking the question, where have we gone wrong? I think like the first thing that most people might sort of agree on is like the way people brought Web3 into gaming was primarily through this idea of ownership. And it meant building economic models that were oriented a little bit more towards the short term rather than focusing on what are things that maybe provide long-term sustaining value for users. That enabled people to be super enthusiastic, to get very excited, but it also meant that people were focusing on the wrong aspects of gaming, rather focusing on how do we build econ models that get enthusiasm today, rather than focusing on what are the things that bring unique value and sort of unique usability into the experiences that people might want to enjoy. And at least this bigger question of like, what were we actually doing and what was this all really for? The games that were being built, you could notice people who were more from the traditional gaming side of the world were looking at the things that were being built and asking the question of like, okay, but who wants all of these like microtransactions or rent seeking or things like that? The metaverse, I think, clearly we're still quite early in terms of what that actually means. And so we could argue that we got a little bit over our skis and we're heading a little bit into the headlong slide into oblivion. And so now it is a bear market again, and I think it's an opportunity for us to start again from first principles, to ask the questions where we can actually drive value. So I'd like to point out, like, what are the pain points that we have in gaming? So one might be data silos. I don't know if folks were paying attention. Google had launched Stadia as this cloud gaming platform, and now they're shutting down. And I mean, there's the first order thing of like people paid for a service that's kind of annoying. But there's also the other component where people played games and got further into the game, and now they have to restart from somewhere else because it's a new platform. One could look at user ownership as another real problem. Maybe this is like earlier on in sort of the cycle, but you look at like Horizon Worlds, they were talking about like a 50% take rate. Arguably, this is because of platform lock-in and sort of being able to, like, you compare that to the 2% take rate that NFTs have. Although maybe NFTs are a little bit more of a polarizing word, it's clear from a percentages standpoint at least that one is more user beneficial than the other. The third I'll point at is maybe cost. What we've seen, so Duelist, I don't know if folks were familiar with this game. It had a pretty large amount of hype in like the early 2019, 2018 era. They ended up having to shutter their servers, and they have a very dedicated community that wanted to play this game. But given the architectural constraints of how Duelist was constructed, when the company, Counterplay Games, had to shut down the servers, the game had to go offline as well. And so there's a question of, can we build things that are more cost efficient or allow users to also host their own infrastructure so that if the costs are too high for one individual company, it still can be supported by the community. Another one that's maybe interesting to keep an eye on is latency. As people are building more and more complex and interesting applications using VR, AR, data generation is going up. And this is an opportunity where if storage and compute are getting cheaper on the consumer side, but bandwidth isn't improving at the same rate, latency is a place where Web3 potentially can provide real value, and where we do see people trying to build applications, even from the Web2 side, that are optimizing to still deliver good user experiences. The last pain point maybe I'll touch on is interoperability. As there's been sort of this Cambrian explosion of people aiming to build things for the metaverse, question marks on what people mean by metaverse, I think that's something we should talk about today as well. We do see this idea where it's like, as we create digital worlds, how do we have objects that are interoperable and can go across these different platforms in ways that actually make for more composability? And this is an area that's highly underspecified, and I think we as a community that think about interoperability, we think about data portability, this is an opportunity for us to sort of lead the way. And so Maybe one thing that is worth calling out here is while we've had this period of exceptional enthusiasm, and now we're sort of in the trial of disillusionment, it's worth just pointing out again that there are some trends in the Web3 favor, and specifically for things like IPFS, where we can lean into the opportunities that we have that other technologies do not. One, data generation is going up. And so this is something where an over-reliance on just purely the cloud is going to mean like higher latency and cost over time. Two, we are building open source tools, and open source compounds. And so really, if we as a community are coming together and thinking through things, we are creating foundations that other people can stand on. And while we might be at the left part of an S-curve, as that compounding builds over time, we can build experiences that will outstrip over time centralized incumbents. And the last is that we actually do have killer features. While these killer features may be nascent, they do exist. Content addressability implies user ownership as well. It implies data portability. And this is something over time can create like a flywheel of having more and more teams align around the same standards, reuse the same tools in a way that allows people to still operate and build their own experiences, but still have something that is compatible with other folks. So that is my arrow of where we are today, but I think that also means that we're getting close to the slope of enlightenment. It's about what we do in the next coming years. So I wanted to highlight my imagined quote from John F. Kennedy about what we as developers, when we think about Web3 gaming, what we should do in this next era, not ask what value we can extract from our users, but what value we can return back to them. And so yeah, just to sort of double down, I think what are the values and what are the things that we can uniquely provide? Content addressing and local first. I do think these are going to be the killer features, especially as we're talking about that data generation piece. I think as we are uncoupling data from specific platforms, I think this is also where we can offer something even to the traditional Web 2 developer, where this could be interesting for them, where we're saying, as you build your applications and your games, your data distribution doesn't have to just go through Steam. This is something where you can just use the internet as a way of serving whatever updates, the binaries, even the assets themselves. You can reduce the footprint, and we'll hear from some folks who are building or tooling in that vein. But we can actually build experiences that are better for users, regardless of whether you were putting it in the bucket of or the qualifier of Web3 or not. Open source and open services, I think, are both other killer features. I don't know if folks have gone to some of the other talks that have happened earlier in this week from the other parts of Lab Week, but things like retrieval markets and open services give us sort of this natural market behind the scenes. As we're building things with content addressing today, it's not just saying what are the cloud services that exist, but it also opens up compatibility as other tools in the Web3 ecosystem come online that can bring costs down. And then the last I'll say is open standards here. As we have more interoperable tooling and shared resources, it means that we can all grow together rather than everyone individually trying to figure it all out by themselves. I'll also call out, Web3 is still nascent, although all of us have been working on this stuff for quite a while. We're still very early. This is Civ 6 if people haven't played it, but we're still very early in the tech tree. And the most important part here is recognizing that that is true. And so it doesn't mean that we have to over-imagine what we can do today, but it's important to realize as we identify what are the unlocks, we also see what are the things that we get. And so we do need to research pottery before we get irrigation, but as we sort of build out each of those incremental things, we all get superpowers together. So one thing I'll also land here is this is an opportunity today for us to all talk and share what we've learned. If we can identify what are the things that we have been running into, we also can identify what are the places where maybe there's opportunities for us to solve problems that cut across everyone in this room. I think once we identify what these gaps are, there's groups like Protocol Labs. We are happy to help fund and make sure that there's open source options for these toolings, but to make sure that we can move together as a community faster and further. I think it also highlights how do we think about sort of what are the properties that we want the web to have. When we think about services, using things like UCANs can be really powerful to enable portability for users and actually lean into the properties that we care about. So yeah, the one other thing I'll say, just as one last note here, is when we think about how we win and how do we actually make all this stuff happen, I don't think we need to over-index on we need to solve all the problems before we can do something valuable. I think we should think about things as what are the practical trade-offs and what gives us one-way doors versus two-way doors. content addressing gives us this magical feature of being able to like do one thing today and then swap stuff out behind the scenes in the future. I would highly encourage us to think about like what are the things that can deliver value to users today using things like Web 2.5. Like lean into content addressing to give yourself and your users powerful options for having like performant things today. But then as we can improve the technology behind the scenes, we can swap it out to all the pieces that we want in the future. And so yeah, for the rest of today, we have a bunch of different folks who are going to speak. This is not everybody who will be talking, but a bunch of really cool teams. I'm really excited for all the talks that we have.